Last week, I took my first painted 500 points of dwarves to my local Warhammer store for a Learn to Play Warhammer the Old World event. So I thought I'd put together some of my thoughts on the event in relation to various topics of debate in the community. Namely, the idea of complexity in the rule system from the perspective of new and returning players, how the Old World fits into GW's product line and its place in stores as well as issues with stock, and the issue of community building more generally and what staying power the system has between launch hype and the bubble of initial sales. Lastly, I'll look at some lessons we can take from this and how you might like to introduce new people to the hobby as well. Timestamps for each of the topics is below. Photos are mostly just ones from old White Dwarf battle reports, but I've put in some rules text where relevant as well. So, the game. It was played between about 8 people, playing lengthwise down a table. That's an interesting one that I'll come back to later. Between the 8, there was quite a range of experience levels in the hobby. Those who played fantasy back in the day, a couple of fathers with their young sons, where kids had a really impressive grasp of the lore and miniatures from the Total War system, and some who were trying it all out from playing AOS armies crossed over, like Ogre Kingdoms. A good few didn't have their own armies, so made use of an already fairly enormous Tomb King's army that one of the staff members had painted up for his own collection in the space of just over a month, which was a fantastically impressive achievement in itself. Most there were very new to the fantasy rules system. Some who'd managed to get their hands on a copy of the rules but had never tried any of it out, others who, for issues of stock, hadn't managed to glance over them at all before the game, and some who had half-remembered rules from 8th edition. It was a case of looking up stat profiles via our old world builder, for instance, just to work out what they were meant to be doing. What I found most interesting in all of this is how people, generally quite fresh to the rules, interpreted or misinterpreted the way that various systems worked. I've consumed far too much old world content leading up to and since its launch, and quite enjoy reading rule systems, so I had a decent-ish grasp of it, and it was just interesting seeing how people who didn't know that much navigated everything and what interpretations they made. In general terms, players expected a table layout like that used for AOS or 40k to work equally well in the old world. The game was set up lengthwise down a 60 by 44 table, complete with scenery bang in the middle. Most people had set up by the time I arrived, so I squeezed my dwarves onto one side. By the end of the evening, my dwarves had made it to about the middle of the board. They never once made contact with the enemy. But never mind. Others did, and it was interesting seeing how they interacted with the rules from almost a kind of game master sort of perspective, I guess. I doubt this will be a surprise to many, but some of the concepts that came up time and again were line of sight, movement, in particular wheeling, the question of which figures could fight with respect to step up and so-called line hammer, and combat resolution. As well as not knowing the rules greatly well, the players there didn't seem to be kind of engaged in the YouTube dialogue around the hobby either. So line hammer wasn't something they knew about. Dragons didn't get a mention at all. So again, I think a lot of the hype and concern people have about those topics is very different when you're in the real early stage of the game with people who don't play already. The idea of anticipating and identifying misconceptions is something that's taught fairly early on when you're training teachers, as it's a really important idea when introducing new concepts, and it links to a whole body of practice to do with checking for understanding, chunking information, modelling examples, and so on. That has quite a lot of relevance when you're teaching someone to play a wargame. Although the rulebook has a good example of some related topics in teaching, like sequencing, being the order in which topics are introduced, so we see a section in general principles in the rulebook that looks at core topics like moving through units and measuring distances that need explaining before other systems can be understood properly. There's less evidence of rules writers considering where players are most likely to have misconceptions. Let's look at working out which figures fight in hand-to-hand combat. Whether based on intuition alone, of how they expected the mechanic to work, or based on their understanding of a similar concept in another system, like AOS, most assume that figures in base-to-base contact would be the ones that could fight. Some of the players noticing spears on some of the Tomb Kings or lances on the Bretonnians asked about the range of weaponry, for example. Convincing players how the system actually worked in the old world, in which the entire fighting rank is permitted to hit, plus all of those in one extra rank behind in the case of spears, took referencing to diagrams and weapon profiles and recitations of the text. Encircling is not in itself an intuitive mechanic for a player, and so for it not to have its own subheading even, and for other rules to read as though it doesn't exist, like when it says any model that is in base contact with an enemy model can fight, is a strange oversight. When it came to the Bretonnian Lance, that's fine. The more kind of shape of the unit, with the horses arranged in that triangle, is an unusual shape. As soon as someone went to charge in, they realised there would be an interaction between pointy-shaped object and straight line of troops that the rules would need to accommodate for, and so they dived into the rulebook without any prompting. When someone knows there's an interaction that they'll need to pay attention to, it's fine. Everything is there in the rulebook, they can understand it. The problem is when they don't anticipate the need for that explanation. This is something a rule system should make a concerted effort to overcome, and to flag up to players. It's the same problem with line of sight. When a player doesn't expect something to be abstracted, they don't go looking for it. Wheeling was a bit stranger. Several players, and I'm not entirely sure why, had this idea that units would turn by pivoting on the spot through any number of degrees, and then walking off in a straight line in that direction. This one stumped me a bit. Whereas with base-to-base contact, you could appeal to the idea of verisimilitude, and how someone might realistically expect an interaction to be represented within a rule set. Rotating an entire formation through a precise number of degrees while maintaining the same frontage would be a remarkably difficult manoeuvre to perform, and makes even less sense in real life than it does on the table. I'll come back to all of this when I'm talking about lessons to learn, but expect in general to get a lot of rules wrong in your first game, expect to face some confusion around fairly core mechanics, and expect to explain a lot more than you might be used to in other systems. It's not as easy as just cutting out certain mechanics, like you might do with, say, command abilities in AOS, and playing for feel and working out things as you need to. You need to dive into the rules before you put models on the table, otherwise it will just be carnage. What about the event itself? Let me preface this by saying how pleasantly surprised I was to see a Learn to Play evening dedicated entirely to the old world at a Games Workshop store. Even though the manager really does put effort into growing the local community and interacting with hobbyists, and although he does typically run one-off events for specialist games, I still wasn't expecting something like this to run. The buzz surrounding the game was great. So, with that out of the way, as we're all aware, the Old World is not a mainline product for Games Workshop, but rather one of its specialist games, perhaps closest in scope to something like Horus Heresy. There's a long-held suspicion, also, that GW has been pushing stores away from what used to be called Veterans Nights, and towards starter sessions for adults who are just beginning in the hobby. To what extent certain stores are given freedom to run such events as they'd like, I'm not entirely sure. I've been quite fortunate, I guess, where I've lived over the last 7 years or so, to have several GW stores I've been to, where the managers have been real advocates for their local community, and in both cases have made that work. Either because of or in spite of their efforts in retaining the veteran hobbyist, depending on which side of the fence you are on this debate. The one I currently visit is just around the corner from a large independent game store, so table space isn't something they have to offer at all, besides for intro games. And yet, they're currently up to 4 members of staff, so if that's not a sign of success, I don't know what is. Anyway, this context of where the Old World sits in GW's product line, and the company's suspected approach nationally towards gaming in stores, is something of a double whammy for community building in the Old World. Before this starts to sound like the moan fest of an entitled hobbyist, stores are only so large, a table is not a product, and the release cycle for the Old World means it doesn't make much sense to dedicate permanent shelf space to it. Also, the emphasis in specialist games is now very much on the word specialist. Even systems like Kill Team and Warcry, that used to get a bit more support, or given their function as skirmish-sized stepping stones into main games, get pushed a bit onto new players. They seem to be changing in function, with the success of things like combat patrols in 40k as one-box starter armies designed for somewhat balanced games using a streamlined rule system. This all does make sense. If you want to channel players into 40k and smooth their path from complete beginners to someone who'll come back and keep buying models, you want to get them playing 40k from the start, rather than selling them a different set of rules for a different system with similar but divergent mechanics. So, in general, Veteran hobbyists, who are the people who are more likely, I would say, to pick up specialist games, are A, not necessarily as catered to in stores nationally, and B, the products that they would be buying aren't on shelves as much, or run as events in stores as much. So this is challenging for the old world, especially because nostalgia is an important component in the game's marketing, miniatures range, and overall rules design, in a way that tries self-consciously to distance itself from some of GW's other systems. Its success in large part will then depend on how many people it can pull back into the fold of GW products, or those it can onboard from things like Total War games. This is where growth would come from, rather than existing customer base just spending their money on Old World instead of AOS. So it needs a way to connect with those, both who drifted away from the hobby or into historical gaming like I did, and those who will be entering it for the first time. Brick and mortar stores are ideally placed to do that, and rekindle the community of returning hobbyists, which is something the Old World really needs, but there isn't a real incentive for those stores to do so. A, like I said, they don't have the shelf space to allocate to Old World products. B, even if they did, the stock issues and slow release cycle would result in them being empty, which is an advert for failing logistics rather than a positive. And C, many of the customers they'd want to draw in already have existing armies, comprised of figures that GW either isn't currently producing, or, as is the case with my 6th Ed Metal Dwarves, is very likely never to sell again, in any capacity. And yet, an event there was. Even having seen it would be taking place, I kind of pointedly went down in advance, with all this context in my mind, just to politely ask if they'd be cool with me bringing long discontinued figures along, because I get where they're coming from with this. But yes, of course they were fine with it. Because like all of us, many of them had a huge sense of nostalgia for this period of GW too, and were excited to see those figures on the table. On the evening itself, it wasn't just those involved in the game, but people popping into the store who came over to look and start chatting about Tomb Kings, Dwarfs, Bretonnians, and so on. So, do I think it generated much in the way of sales for them? No, not really. The Bretonnians and Tomb Kings range were largely out of stock on the web store by the time it had come around, and although Orcs have just today been announced, we didn't know that at the time, nor did we know how far off in the future they would be. But the store was able to highlight how their pre-ordering system works for product launches, given the queues many had faced on the web store at launch. So when Dwarf releases do eventually come around, I'll revisit them for that. Lessons overall then. 1. Don't overestimate how much a new player, or even someone familiar with AOS, will need concepts to be front-loaded in learning games, spelling out how something will take place before it happens. I can't emphasise this enough. Sitting down and reading through the rules before you play is really valuable, especially so with a newcomer, and even then, expect to get a lot wrong. 2. Don't assume straight away that you're not welcome at your local store. It might be worth asking. My experience was wholly positive, and I know there are people in the area now, both customers and staff, who will want to play games of the Old World in the future somewhere else. And 3. Putting painted figures on the table is a great way to get conversation started about it. Just being visible in the community, showing off models, giving someone a glimpse at the aesthetic of the Old World, is enough to generate interest and start community building process that we will all need to be a part of. So, there are some reflections. Some of the points here, like the interaction between Old World and other rule systems, be they fantasy or historical, seems like quite a rich seam of material to me that I haven't seen a huge amount of discussion on, and it's something that's quite interesting to me, so I might put together a few more discussion videos on things like formations, movement, abstraction, skirmish screens, and so on, as general concepts in wargaming if that's something of interest. Anyway, good luck with all your hobbying and gaming, and until next time.